says, when you take on leadership, you do what's necessary, what has to be done. I'll tell you an image from Saturday, our session Saturday, that sticks in my head.
Well, I grew up in Rochester, born and raised in Rochester, and we initially lived at 80 Reynolds Street with my grandparents, my aunt, her two kids, and my great aunt. So it was a full house. Later, when I was about 9 or 10, we moved into the 19th Ward. What was unusual about that is my parents did not get the opportunity to look inside the house they wanted to purchase. They had to send someone who happened to be white to look inside their house because there was sort of a covenant in the 19th Ward not to sell homes to African Americans. When they eventually moved furniture and their children in, they were surprised, in fact shocked, to get letters from what was listed as the Millbank Street Ku Klux Klan. But they were undeterred. My mother at the time had her master's degree from the University of Rochester School of Education, was working on her doctorate, which she subsequently earned. So these were these little glitches as we moved, like they said, moving on up. When we moved into the 19th Ward, we, my brother and I, went to school number 37, which was on Congress Avenue. A very nice setting for anybody who wanted to get a good education. And I had some fine teachers in that environment. Later moved on to West High School, which is now closed, but the building is still functioning as a high school on Genesee Street.
What did you study? What were your interests?
Well, my interests revolved around, we'd call it sociology. What are those organizations and systems and people who make the world what it is, and how do they interact, and how do they succeed? How do they effectively succeed? To think about what the colleges I wanted to go to, I definitely wanted to leave home. And we met with the guidance counselor, and he gave me a couple of ideas and a couple of options, and we landed on a college I'd never heard of before. It was then called Harper College. It's now the State University at Binghamton. And we went down to Vestal, New York, where it was located. The one thing I remember is stopping in at a McDonald's at that time, and it said 2 million sold, meaning the number of hamburgers sold. Now it's into the billions, so that's how long ago it was. It was a total cultural shock in a way, because there were only, at that time, 6 African Americans who were in the undergraduate school out of about 1,500 students. And a lot of the students were from New York City, schools like Bronx Science and Stuyvesant. So I was introduced to a totally different cultural experience. And it has boded well for me going forward, because I've learned to connect, appreciate many different people and cultures. Well, at that time, we really didn't have fraternities or sororities, but there were, along with that half a dozen African American students, there were about a half a dozen Latino students, Chinese, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, and others, and we formed something called the Afro-Latin Alliance. It lasted not too long, because the next year, critical masses of African Americans and Latinos came to campus, and we sort of broke off into the Black Student Union and the Latino Student Union and moved forward in that way. But that first year of connectedness, when we had the Afro-Latin Alliance, was also an eye-opener as to how coalitions could be built and people could work together effectively.
Would you call yourself an organizer, or were you a leader in this organization?
I was behind the scenes leader, and I always had a cultural interest. So I got together with a PhD in the English department by the name of Larry Gottheim, And we decided to make a 16 millimeter film about the Afro-Latin Alliance. We call it ALA, the Afro-Latin Alliance. And we actually went down to New York City and filmed some of the families and some of the students who came up to the campus. And it was probably a half an hour 16 millimeter film. The soundtrack was conversations, discussions that the group had had over a series of months. And that was an adventure. We were riding around with my little Volkswagen convertible. I'm driving, he's filming out of the back of it with no knowledge that you can't do that in New York City without a filming permit, but we did not get arrested. Going to a television station in Scranton, Pennsylvania with Moviola, cutting the tape, editing the film, sending it to the New York film labs and getting it in print and showing it on campus. Pretty exciting times. All spun off from the fact that these few African Americans and Latino students had gotten together.
When you graduated, what were your plans?
Well, you know, this was the time where there was a lot of upheaval in the country and the community, and I wanted to survive and thrive, find places to work, to use my energies, use my talents. And I moved through basically a number of job situations and finally landed on one that gave me sort of maximum freedom, which was working for a small company in the insurance and investment field. And I became an insurance agent, marketing insurance and mutual funds, and did that for almost a quarter of a century. But in my spare time, the photography was one of the real passions. And I also developed a connection and a passion for looking at what African Americans were doing positive. And it was really sparked when a woman who was an activist at the time in Rochester by the name of Mildred Johnson saw me with the camera and said, "Rodney, if you really want to do something effective with that camera, you will take pictures of African Americans doing things that are positive, because most of the media sort of captures us at our worst." That resonated. And I've always sort of kept the camera handy to catch activities where African Americans are being excellent, doing things positive. And by having that sort of appreciative inquiry, looking for the positive, looking for a change in the narrative, the standard narrative, looking for opportunities to showcase where African Americans have been doing well and things excellently has opened my eyes and has served me well over the years. Later, I moved my photography in the direction of Students in Africa, a project that was started by 4 women here in Rochester to take students to Senegal and Ghana, West Africa, during the February and April breaks. These were magnificent women who were on a faith journey to expose African American kids to the cultural realities of Africa, but also to raise the bar on expectations. They expected excellence. They expected that the curriculum that they were developing for students on this educational tours would match the New York State criteria for educational excellence. This was a wonderful experience. I often said, I hope your husbands see you being excellent like I'm seeing you during this process. Alice Gissendaner, Marva Gibson, Betty Rainey, Evelyn Hubbard, Katrina Hubbard, and Dr. Rita Gaither were very influential during that process. I got involved in that in 1995 and continued with them until they closed that corporation in 2006. During that time, I was able to go on 8 trips to West Africa, Senegal, and Ghana. It enhanced my understanding of the realities of the world. And I think the more you see of the world, the more beautiful it is, the more you appreciate it, the more you appreciate the people in the world. Our kids who went on those trips thought in some cases that they were poor, but they saw realities that opened their eyes to the richness here in America and why everybody's trying to get here. The educational opportunities that are free, the economic opportunities, the political freedoms that we have are so rare in many cases as compared to the rest of the world. They would come back and almost kiss the ground, saying thank you with an appreciation and with an energy to do better, to excel, to be great, to be excellent themselves. So those opportunities I will always cherish, but always carrying that camera to capture those experiences and to bring those experiences back through film and through story.
How did you get involved with AALDP?
I have one person to express my thanks to, and that was the late Betty Rainey. Betty Rainey was someone who worked for Rochester Area Community Foundation, dealing with their scholarships. And she was also just a very bright and positive person. And she said, Rodney, 2 things you need to get involved with: students in Africa. She was a partner with Students in Africa, and something called the United Way's African American Leadership Development Program. I said, what in the world is that? It turns out that 1995 was fortuitous because I went to Senegal, West Africa with Students in Africa that year, and also participated in the African American Leadership Development Program in what some would say was the best class. The African American Leadership Development experience increased the pipes that I was capable of putting material through, understanding connectedness through. It was a life-changing experience. And right then and there, I said, if the opportunity ever came up for me to coordinate that program, God, let me do it. Because to connect people with the opportunity to serve and to serve effectively, to learn about how systems work, to learn about how boards are structured and how people can be effective in setting policy, the missions of organizations, and monitoring those organizations to help them be more effective.
I started working with Rodney in 2011. I joined the United Way as their chief HR officer. But really, my first opportunity in meeting Rodney was as the coordinator of the African American Leadership Development Program with United Way. As a matter of fact, I'm a graduate of the 2009 class, so that's how I initially met Rodney, being in the community, and then lo and behold, 2 years later, I come on board as an employee of United Way.
Now, Coach writes for the Atlantic magazine.
Rodney is very committed and steadfast to the AALDP with United Way. Rodney has been the coordinator of the African American Leadership Program for the last 15 years. As a matter of fact, Rodney is a 1995 graduate of the program. But Rodney works tirelessly year in and year out to make sure that we have the best facilitators, the best volunteers, and to make sure that we can do everything we can do to make it a stunning program. Rodney is a tireless leader. He reads a lot. He's involved in the community, and he shares all that with our participants in the class.
It has been a magnificent journey to connect with leaders who in 1 year could be, education-wise, could be GED to PhD, 20 to 60, to come from all kinds of backgrounds, work in all kinds of environments. So I thank the United Way for having the foresight to invest time, energy, and resources in the development of leaders in this community. I thank those volunteers who have been such a vital part of the success of the African American, Latino, and other leadership development programs. And I sincerely thank those employers by the scores who have sent employees through these programs. Now, the programs have gone from the Hispanic, which is now called the Latino Leadership Development Program, to the African American Leadership Development Program, to the Asian South Pacific Island Leadership Development Program, to the LGBTQ Leadership Development Program, to the Young Professionals Leadership Development Program. United Way is sponsoring a whole suite of leadership development programs, encouraging people to take up the reins of community organizations and other volunteer and policy-making positions so that we can move the needle on those problems that have been plaguing this community, poverty and others. As conveners, United Way has played this powerful role for over 33 years of infusing this community with leaders who have taken their place on committees and boards and even been more effective in religious organizations and even in their own households. One of the things we're learning is that not all of the not-for-profits that we need have yet been established. And there was a committee headed by Dr. David Anderson who realized there was a need for capturing and preserving and extending the reality of African American storytelling. I turned out not to be a storyteller. There are people with that talent. I don't have it. So I was relegated in a positive way to be roles like the treasurer and things like that. But we did set up the Rochester Black Storytelling League as a legitimate not-for-profit. And I was partnered with them for a while, an experience I'll never forget. But it also points out the importance of knowing your story and being able to tell your story and being willing to share your story. We have magnificent stories. We are writing a new narrative. The old narrative was you were enslaved, you were discriminated against, you were criminals, you were incarcerated, but that's not the narrative. The narrative is similar to my stories, my family's narrative, where my grandmother graduated from Hampton Institute in 1906. My mother went to the U of R, got a couple of degrees, became one of the founding trustees of MCC, distinguished career as an educator in the city school district. That's the part of the narrative that's being left out when we look at the African American narrative. We need to recapture those stories, tell those stories, nourish our children with those stories so we can move forward in a positive way.
When did you get your first camera? I know it must have been a film camera. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When did you get your first camera, and talk about how you've used it to capture life around you and history?
The first time I remember a photograph that I've taken was when my grandfather, John Amos Holloway, died. And this was in North Carolina. And at that time, the casket, open casket, was in a home. And it was in a home, and his body was there. And I was a young teenager at the time. And as we were leaving the home to go to the funeral, I stepped out and I had a small camera, and I turned around and I saw my grandmother just about to exit the home ahead of her husband's body. And I looked up at the sky, and somehow the sky looked green and purple. And I snapped a shot, and I don't know where that picture is, but it's probably the best expression of mourning that perhaps I'll ever see. Because here's someone who had built her life around a farmer in North Carolina and the family they created. And she was taking his remains to the church for the funeral and the final disposition of the body. When I looked at that picture, I was shocked at what was captured, the emotion. And again, the person, the sky behind her, the clouds, and I said, now this is powerful. That's the first image I remember taking, and that resonated. Somehow I had to figure out how to get another picture like that. I've yet to do that, but I sure keep trying.
When you're taking pictures, what are you trying to capture in that frame?
We all have music, and some of us play the music pretty loudly, and some of us have yet to play the music. We're going to probably die with the music still in us. So what I'm trying to capture is some of the music that the person has within them. It could be in the smile, it could be in the tilt of the head, it could be in the hands, it could be in just the glint in the eyes. But let me see if I can take away just a little bit of the story and the music that you have to tell. It goes back to high school. A woman by the name of Mary Barnum, who was an English teacher, saw that I was staying around not doing a whole lot in high school, so she said, Rodney, you're going to be our yearbook photographer. And she took me to a place called Carhart's to buy a 35 millimeter camera. She bought that camera, she gave it to me, she made me swear that I would protect that camera with my life. I put it in my locker, and the next day I opened my locker and it was gone. Somebody had stolen it. So she found this old Rolleiflex camera where it popped up and you had to look down in it, and it had this odd shaped film that they put in it. And that's where I learned how to take photography, take photographs. But it taught me to observe. It taught me to quiet myself and to really look at what was going on. And then it gave me the opportunity to capture that image. And it's amazing when you capture that image and you begin to study it and share it and show other people what they look like. Because we walk around and we don't really have a true sense of what we look like unless you're an egotist and you're passing every mirror and taking a look at it. And it's refreshing to point out to people that they are photogenic. No matter what they look like, they're special, they're unique, they're photogenic. I became very interested in the African American story and the fact that we've had old pictures in my family, and I don't know who those people are necessarily, but I knew it was important for them to be captured at that time in those pictures, in those images. And I always tried to take pictures and share them with the folks that I've taken pictures of. Now it's easy with electronically sharing those pictures, because these are stories and they're time capsules, and they are the lives we're living. 7 billion people, you don't get to meet that many of those 7 billion, and I treasure every person I get a chance to stand in front of, who allow me to take their picture and pass it on to others. Now we've got Facebook and other places to post pictures, and I think that's great.
You really are capturing a little bit of humanity every time you take pictures.
I really got into the photography as we were taking students to West Africa. And I began to see how those students were interacting with the experience. We took one group to Gorée Island, which in Senegal was a favorite place to go. And there was one young man who is probably as thin as my hand. He reminded me of when I was a kid, believe it or not, and very brown skin and somewhat enclosed. And when we took him to Gorée Island, and the teenagers there realized he was from America, they surrounded him like a rock star. And you could see him lifting himself to his full height. It was almost like a plant that was getting water and sunshine for the first time. And I realized how important the ego, feeding the ego and understanding of self and appreciation of self is. And sometimes in this culture, our African American youth don't get that nourishment that they need. This young man was so full of something he couldn't even describe at that time. And he almost cried when we had to leave because he knew he was moving from that environment. But to record that and to show him that picture where he's the center of attention surrounded by these beautiful young teenagers, it didn't help that there were young women involved in that also. And to be able to capture that so that he can reflect on that and understand and recall that feeling, because that's going to be powerful as he builds from a teenager into a young man, into a professional, into someone who has his own children.
You're taking a lot of pictures of organizations in Rochester. It seems like when I look at your pictures, you seem to snap it at just the right moment. Seems to me.
Well, you try to snap it when the tension's gone. Just before you take the picture, there's joy and there's not stress, there's a lack of tension. And then when you are about to take the picture, people tense up. And I try to catch it before they tense up or right after they've tensed up and then start to relax. I'm also very interested in taking photographs of organizations like the Deltas, AKA, and especially the Links, because the Links represent a coming together of powerful women who are doing good all the time as part of their four facets. And my mother's a Link, so I can see the history of that. I can see how they're bringing in younger women on a regular basis and expanding their interests and dynamics and capturing some of that.
When people see your pictures 50 or 100 years from now, let's say a collection of your work looking at Rochester history, what would you like them to think or say about Rodney Young's pictures?
I'm glad he was there. I'm glad he captured that. So as the photographer of last resort, I will get pictures that someone else may not get. At the same time, I'll be right there when a Mayor Johnson becomes mayor or Mayor Lovely Warren is installed as mayor, because those are some of the real highlights of Rochester and the highlights of my life. And it shows that progress is truly being made. So to be able to point to progress being made and to photograph it, even in the small way that I do it, I'm not a professional, is gratifying, and we just hope that people will appreciate that in the future.